find it necessary to make sure that I call out that my children are with us today. That'll be the only time I put them on spot. But thank you, Shakina. I think this is really fun. I think this is really fun because Brent and I talked about how Shakina announced to the world with our pictures in PDF and images a topic that we really didn't have prepared. And so it was fun to fit the square peg into the round hole and then kind of put together something really fun. And I think the fun part about this is that Brent and I are also fairly different humans, which is really fun to then have prepared this. So I'm going to share my perspective on managing time. And I think I'm going to start with what I think is a really important two things in my life, which is Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin and Hobbes mean a lot to me, but also Carl Sagan. That'd be a fun hangout. And I find it really important to start this entire conversation with two very important facts about managing time and setting goals. I am not good at managing time, nor am I good at setting goals. And I want to start with that for an important reason. One is that I'm not going to present any kind of expert knowledge, but I do think one of the ways that we are talking about time, one of the ways that I want to talk about time today, is managing time and understanding my place in time has been a pretty big journey. And it's been a journey that has involved mental health struggles and a journey that has involved education. It's a journey that involved becoming a teacher and then not becoming a teacher. And so in all of this, I think one thing that I want to set the tone with is that I'm not going to leave you here with any kind of expert knowledge, but it's going to be a fun way to talk about time. So that being said, bad at managing time, bad at setting goals. So I want to start at least the conversation with this thought. I think the reality is that one of the things I've discovered over time is, that was intended, is the ideas of time that have been talked about through school, through social media, through the news, really tended to rub me the wrong way, and I hated time. And I think I remember helping to clean out my parents' basement and finding a report card in which the report card notes, remember the old school ones where you had to write and there was like a box this big where the teacher wrote the note, and the note said, Jason speaks really well and can be very funny, but doesn't keep track of his time. And I think the reality is that that's just continued. That I haven't changed in that regard. And I think that context set is that I had my favorite fifth grade teacher pulled me aside and said, Jason, I have no doubt one day, his name was Mr. Bozold, by the way, so I want to, if he exists in the YouTube world, I'll get it out there eventually. But he said, I have no doubt one day that you are going to stand in front of people and tell jokes and share knowledge, but you have to do your homework. The reality was that there was a balance. He was like, that stuck with me to this day, because I think the reality is that meant something to me. He was acknowledging that I had something good, acknowledging I also have to fit into this box. So, continued on this journey in life and started to play around with kind of where I fit. And this is I promise we're getting to managing time, we're getting to that conversation. But I put these images out there because, and I mentioned to Brent, I really wanted to keep this slide in there because each of these has a very specific meaning to a very specific stage in my life. This is an early stage in college where there was a lot of exploration of different mindsets and trying to figure out where I fit in life. But they each have a very specific space. And they led to this understanding that, like everyone, searching for meaning, I just decided to then, unbeknownst to my conscious choices, really ask the question of where we exist and how do we fit. And I remember going on a spring break trip with my parents with family friends to this horrible Wisconsin Dells hotel where you can swim, and it just what I was I think I was 20. And just at 20 years old, a swim park, indoor swim park, doesn't have the same feel. And I remember sitting in the hotel room, and I discovered that NASA had all these images for free on their website. And I was like, well, I guess I'm going to do this for the rest of the night. And then I came across this image, and I hadn't seen it in my life yet. And the little blue dot, the pale blue dot image, was, to this day, it's still one of the most impactful things I can look at. Because it became a reminder that this little dot, that's Earth. And this is not like some composite image. This is not some fantastical CGI image. This is literally a satellite that we turned around and took a picture as it was traveling millions and millions and millions of miles away from Earth. And it was like, why is that comforting? And I've had this conversation with my therapist regularly. The comfort of discovering that we exist on that tiny blue dot is one of the most centering pieces of managing time and managing anxiety and managing all the stress for me. And so I'm going to present the context from there and then go a little bit further. So as Shakina mentioned, prior to my life at Triton, I worked as a Montessori teacher. I was a Montessori educator for grades 1st through 3. Taught tiny humans, loved it, have transitioned on. But it was really impactful because it hit me at a professional point in my life where it took time and put it into suddenly this curriculum. And I was like, this is really cool. And Montessori education, we teach for 1st through 3rd graders, every year we teach the concept of time starting from the biggest to the smallest. We literally teach history starting with the Big Bang. And over the course of a student's 3-year cycle that you get them, and then over their 6-year cycle, you're teaching it in a spiral. You teach the same lesson for an elementary student, 1st through 6th grade, the same lesson for 6 years. But every year, there's a layer of experience, there's a layer of knowledge, there's a layer of understanding that starts to get built in. Teaching time through that lens, for me as the teacher, as any teacher knows, suddenly became more impactful than I was teaching. And I got more excited to teach the lessons than I sometimes did for the students learning it. And I was like, how are you not excited by this? I'm like, well, I don't know, I'm hungry. I was like, well, this is so cool. But this concept, this kind of taking these things that for my entire life had been told are taught in sequence. You know, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, was a collection of stories, and it really helped to change how I viewed this structure. It wasn't something that essentially was always sequential because time isn't sequential. Time is a flat circle. So, history of the universe. This is where I start, again, to, I'll say this regularly because I promise we're getting to managing time, but my managing time starts with understanding that we started like somewhere in there, billions of years ago. And teaching that over the course of the last 10 years played this role in helping me to understand, okay, Mr. Bozold, I get you. I should do my homework, but can I also ask bigger questions and trying to find that balance? And so one of the ways that we help students to start to see where they fit into the world as Montessori teachers is we teach this concept of clock of eons and clock of eras. And my favorite moment every single year was reminding the students that this little black line or that little green line, that's the time that we live in, and the rest of the circle is the history of life, the history of the universe. Again, it's not recommended for everyone, but reducing anxiety for me is acknowledging that we are in that green sliver and understanding how to structure my thoughts in time come through the lens of asking the question, what are we doing in that little green sliver? So further on down the curriculum, further on down in my understanding over time, started to get really into this idea of what is, okay, let's get a little bit closer. We live on Earth, so I should spend some time learning about Earth, the geological timeline of Earth, right? I actually love this image because this image was produced around 10 years ago. It's currently wrong, which is why I love it. And we'll get to the thing that why I love that is. But I actually heard an interview 2 or 3 days ago by one of the authors that I'll quote later on in this presentation that talked about what is this geological timeline of Earth? What do these layers look like in 1 billion years? Is one of these layers going to be like iPads and laptops like smashed into with the history of time? Maybe, but I love this concept because it points out that at some point, and this is the transition moment for the public speaking teachers in the room. At some point, we had to determine facts, order. We had to create some type of system. This geological scale, there is not a single place on Earth that has it exactly structured that way if you find an outcrop of rocks. But there are really cool places where you can see something like that. But this then carried me into this fun conversation around like, oh, well, those rocks you see are created by this millions of years of cycle. Again, anxiety-reducing moment when I realized that these rocks that we are seeing that are helping us understand time aren't static. They're constantly changing, constantly moving. The water we're drinking is constantly part of a cycle. Helps, it again, part of that process of like, okay, this is where I fit. I'm part of a million-year cycle. This rock I'm holding on to could be 2.5 billion years old. There's me. Those rocks behind me right there, 2.5 billion years old. Not even as old as the Earth. That's crazy. There's still a whole 1.5 billion years to go for me to get back to the beginning of formation of Earth. But this led to then this journey, and this is when I started to really see the power of the standards, the structure, but then searching for ways to question it, is when I started to play around with, okay, like where do we fit? Where do we fit in this time, this lifespan, this time span of life, right? I think going back to my Calvin and Hobbes butterfly quote earlier, like a butterfly's life for 1 to 2 weeks, that doesn't mean that their life is any less worthy. It just means that their concept of time is different if they have dreams, which is cool. Oldest living plants. That butterfly that lived for 1 to 2 weeks, or those humans that lived for an average of 79 years, are nothing. Look at that. It's like just so cool to think that there are still living things that are 100,000 years old. And then I started to discover some of these facts and realized scientists are making these. Like someone had to build this. This is another thing I'm stealing from a Montessori classroom, but then we started to discover all these facts about how to take the geological time by radiological timing and using all these other really cool tools. But again, that little orange arrow in the far side of that picture over there, that's humans. So as scientists started to discover more and learning more, we also discovered, wow, we are just a dot. We're a little pale blue dot on our own planet. And like that, again, whew, just feel it. Stress, drop off your shoulders. Those of you that live in the nerd world like I do will sing this song in their head right now. Those of you that don't get that reference, it's okay. You don't enjoy Broadway the way that you should. I won't judge you. But as Harvey, my youngest in the back, was reading this earlier, he was like, wow, we spend a lot of time in bed. We do. It's true. But I think this to me is one of my favorite facts because it is a reminder that we had to set standards of time to understand the time, to realize that we really don't mean anything in the grand scheme of time. But there's a lot happening in that tiny little period of time. So that leads me to my thesis statement here. I realized what Mr. Bozel was telling me. I have had to learn this. Mr. Bolzer was basically telling me, like, I can be the class clown, but I can't be the class clown if I don't understand comedy. I can question the need to do homework if I can figure out why the homework exists. And how that then carried on later into life was this discovery that while I was rebelling against everything in my early 20s, and then slowly started to gather more of life, I realized this really fun fact, that the things that I was questioning, I was only able to question because people for centuries before me had spent time cataloging it, had spent time learning about it, had spent time translating it. This is the Rosetta Stone. It's not just an app. And that led to then the journey that continues, where every book I read, every person I talk to feels like there is that another point of having that question. The idea that the stories we tell, the information that we learn, the information that we read, is really just telling this story about ourselves. It's really this conversation we're having with ourselves. And then becoming cognizant of that process, it's part of the process of learning the world around us while also learning who we are. And I think one of the exciting parts is that when you learn something new about anything, you learn something about a shape of a leaf, you learn something about why a database does a certain thing, you become aware of it and you start to see it everywhere then. You start to see it literally, you turn the corner and you're like, oh, I know that's a maple tree. Or I know what that query means. I know why that dashboard doesn't work. And that, to me, was the beautiful recognition that, like, oh, you could do the same thing for yourself. Like, you can have that same, like, you become more aware of yourself, you turn the corner and you see yourself again, and you start to ask those questions about yourself. And that was possible because I started to have these interactions as I'm reading books, right? But then I also started to have fun with going all the way back to Mr. Bolzold and my resistance to the way the standards were set. Because it started to weave into this also understanding of the cycles of life. The rock cycle, the water cycle, the curriculum cycles. In the end, the solidity that we dream of, that we live in, not to like make anybody feel existential real quick and like you don't mean anything, but there is no solidity, and I think that was a really calming piece for me, to realize that 4 billion years of Earth is really nothing in the grand scale of the history of the universe. 80 years is really nothing in the history of the Earth, but it still means something because someone had to discover the numbers in the process. Someone had to ask the questions. Someone had to catalog the information. But again, cycling back through my favorite point, even the great libraries eventually dissolve. No offense. Sorry, libraries aren't going to fold. Hopefully the Triton Library doesn't go the way of the Great Library of Alexandria. That would be a really crazy experience. But I love this image because it's literally a facade of the Great Library of Alexandria. And people have asked questions of like, what could have been discovered in there? What existed in there? Probably thousands of years of history recorded that is now destroyed by war. There's a whole other topic. That's another Triton talk we'll do later. So that leads to coming up on now. And we had lots of conversations about the melting polar ice caps recently and the meaning behind it. I put this in there because while I do enjoy sometimes having those conversations about the role that we're playing as humans, this is one of my favorite images that exists in the world, and I love this image simply because it is just so darn beautiful. And I love it because when I look at it, I'm asking the question of what animals live on, like what animals are using that? Why is it shaded that way? Is it artificially shaded? Was the sun shining? What is this? Did it break off or did it erode? Those questions are questions that I've only learned to ask by having those conversations I was having before, where I'm learning more about the world, so I know to ask those questions. And I know to ask those questions because I've learned to love that it is often our life's work to challenge and mistrust those measures, to challenge the measures, but you can't challenge them if you don't know them. You can't say 2 + 2 is 6 unless you know that 2 + 2 is 4, and then you have some type of philosophical understanding and presentation as to why it is 6. I don't actually think it's 6. But if you do, cool. So that leads to then the idea that I've now taken to this place where we become the custodians of that information, the custodians of the world around us, the custodians of how we talk about what we understand, and we acknowledge that we play a role in noting it, we play a role in recording it, and we play a role in questioning it. And understanding that it could mean something to you, it could mean something to someone else, it can mean nothing to no one. I love this image because it's someone spent the time to take pictures of the alphabet and the numbers that existed naturally on animal fur and skin throughout the world. So those are all legit images that were discovered over the course of time. Obviously National Geographic. And I think the idea of kind of managing time and holding on to it is that really cheesy and cliche, like we all are unique and we all do it on our own. But to me, it's become that place where I reduce anxiety, I reduce stress by understanding that the systems exist, I question the systems, and then I create more systems, and then I question the systems, and I just keep going in that cycle. So, but I will say, it's not always that simple. It's not always in order. And I think it's a reminder that sometimes becoming an adult is acknowledging that you'll never become an adult. So, with that, I want to hand it over to my counterpart, Brent, to further the conversation. Also, thank you to Elizabeth for signing for us for this. This is really cool.
Thank you. Good afternoon, or should I say good late morning, depending on which side of the prime meridian you are sitting on. That look familiar? Little blue dot. That was actually just my holding slide, but I thought this was appropriate. So today's event, today's talk, was billed as follows. We had this flyer with the photographs of two gentlemen, both bearded, both intelligent, and if I might say, both quite handsome. But there are two other guys, you can nod your head, there are two other guys that I feel could easily be billed on this flyer. The first of which, the founder of Western thought and philosophy, a man by the name of Socrates, a man whose craft was questioning and inquiry, commonly known and remembered for his statement, "An unexamined life is not worth living." The other guy I would have liked to see on this bill, Sean Carter. You didn't see that one coming now. Better known as Jay-Z. One of rap's greats, wordsmith, lyricist, performer, businessman, who tapped his inner Julius Caesar when he rapped, "I came, I saw, I conquered." What do these two gentlemen have in common? They have something unique in common. Separated by an entire ocean, separated by 24 years 2,400 years. That time thing of history. Neither of these guys wrote anything down in regards to their craft. What we know about Socrates comes from the dialogues of Plato. Jay-Z didn't write his rhymes in a notebook. He didn't type them into his phone. They were all upstairs. Do I recommend the methods of these greats? To be determined. Years ago, I taught a course on study skills and student success, and the curriculum covered things such as time management and goal setting, communication styles. And one of my favorite things we did in that class was an assignment on note-taking. So I would have my students analyze and reflect on the notes that they took at the beginning of the course and then toward the end of the course, after we covered the section on note-taking where we talked about techniques and strategies and systems, to see if they noticed a difference, any significant difference in terms of how they took their notes and how they used their notes. As a speech instructor, my focus on notes turned more toward the performative as a memory aid, as an aid of recall. So not so much learning and processing information, but rather remembering it and encouraging my students to use notes in a manner that was most effective for them to deliver their message to their audience. And working in testing for the past 10 years now, notes are a taboo. Notes are not permitted. Notes are not allowed on 99% of exams. But I will say that I have witnessed and observed a number of test candidates over the years try to create and use notes in a manner which is highly creative and clever. But that is a talk for another day. But my point here is that through this summation of experiences, it has continually challenged me to rethink, reassess, and reconsider notes. Raise your hand if you do a to-do list, if you keep a daily to-do list. All right? Raise your hand if you write in a journal or a diary. All right. Raise your hand if you somehow track your physical activity throughout the day, whether in a notebook or an app, your sleep cycle, what you eat. Raise your hand if you're the type of person who makes a grocery list before you go to the grocery store. These are my people. I know there's two types of people in this world, the grocery list people and the non-grocery list people. And I only get along with the one side. We are constantly taking notes, using notes, creating notes. This is not just some academic endeavor that's limited to the classroom or an academic environment. We are using notes to help us navigate through our daily lives, sometimes by the hour, sometimes by the 15-minute mark on our Outlook calendars to get to the next meeting. Notes help us track, organize, prioritize, process, recall, learn. It's a pretty big deal. Today, I want to share with you some of my observations and insights about notes through my experiences by asking and addressing three questions. What are notes? How did they come about? And what do they say about us? In other words, notes on notes. And if you came here for the wordplay, you are in the right place. All right, so our first question, what are notes? This may seem like a very simple and obvious question, but I promise you, things will build. So, in attempting to explore this question, I think it's important that we look at language and usage. When you came in today, you probably thought, oh, if Brent's going to talk about notes, he's probably going to be referred to something like this. And you wouldn't necessarily be wrong, but we need to remember that these are one form of notes. These are another form of notes, a highly highly valuable form of notes. Banknotes, stacks of hundreds, C notes. And if you don't have enough C notes, then you might end up with one of these C notes, a car note. We have notes that are low-tech, America's favorite, the Post-it note. We have notes that are high-tech, Samsung's favorite, the Galaxy Note. We have notes that you can smell, fragrances, perfumes, colognes, base notes, heart notes, top notes, aromatherapy. We have notes that you can taste, coffee, chocolate, wine, tea. We have notes that you can hear. And of course, we have these. If we trace the word note back to its known origin, the Latin nota, N-O-T-A, a mark or to mark. And why that's important is because the word note can serve as two parts of speech. As a noun, we know a note as a memory aid or an informal record, piece of writing, characteristic, or a sound, things we saw in those illustrations just a second ago. As a verb, to note is to observe, to record, to indicate. Two parts of speech happening here. We see the root word of nota in connotation, denotation, notation, annotation, notification, and the root note in keynote, side note, footnote, endnote, noteworthy, and of course, notorious. Our phrases, if we want to acknowledge something, we say noted. If we want to double down on that acknowledgement, we say duly noted. If something's important, it's of note. And if so, you better notice and take note. And if you want to see what your friends thought, then you're going to compare notes. If you want to transition and emphasize on that note, you better make a note to yourself, which is a form of a mental note. Hopefully, you and I today are striking a note so that we can end on a high note. Spectrum. The spectrum of notes. The most informal of notes is just a note. As things move down the spectrum and get more serious, a note becomes a notice. If you're drawing up a notice or receiving a notice, something in your life is probably not right. On the far end of the spectrum, if a note becomes notarized, wow, that's official. My point here is the linguistic versatility of the word note, both a noun and a verb, things that we can hear, smell, touch, taste, read, write, low-tech, high-tech. Very powerful word. I want you to keep that in mind as we dive into our second question of exploration. Where did notes come from? So let's take a very, very small sliver of time and look at some tools and technology. You may think, oh, well, notes come from writing. And I'm not saying you're wrong. Our earliest known forms of writing, Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphics. Circa 3000 BC, only 5,000 years ago, not that too long ago. We go even before that, 35,000 years ago, we got cave paintings. These handprints on the cave, think of that as the first "I was here" note. And even prior to that, we have drawings that served as notes. Red charcoal rubbed along this rock to indicate something, to observe something, to record something, to note something. Flash forward 73,000 years, our digital notes, things like Google Docs and other platforms where we can contribute to each other's notes, track each other's notes, make notes on each other's notes. The devices themselves notifying us constantly, notifications. It's almost noon. It's time for my third boiled egg of the day. I don't know what your notes say, but that's what mine say. There are other forms of note-taking that we often don't think about, which deserve to be highlighted here today. Mental notes. We talked about that phrase earlier. Mnemonics. Did anyone ever learn the two fists in front of you to learn how many days are in the months? Right? No, okay. I just learned that one myself. Still working on it. The ABCs as a sing-song lyric. Right? Different strategies to recall information. I see some head nods in the back. I like that. Right? The memory palace. Anyone familiar with the memory palace? Right? Using location. Right? Having a map in your head of your house or maybe a castle. I don't know. In today's housing market, a castle is really hard to afford. But all right, so that one didn't hit. Okay. But the memory palace is where you imagine you're walking through your house, and with each room that you go into and each object that you interact with, you're associating it with pieces of information. This was a technique and a strategy that was used by the Greeks and the Romans when they did their hours and hours and hours of oratory. How else were they going to remember what they were going to say without having slides? We also have notes in the form of the object, represented right here. This skull is the first item I bought online. eBay, $19.99. The year, the price, $19.99. It's still with me today, and it's a prop that I use when I'm teaching my speech class. I have an assignment called the object speech. And students have to deliver a short 2 to 3 minute presentation in which they're presenting on something that misrepresents them, something that they use every day but dislike, and something they can't live without. And the catch to this assignment is they can't use any written notes. So they have to use objects. Right? So instead of a memory palace, they've got their equivalent of skulls that they're bringing to class to help them remember what they want to say. Has anyone ever really tied a string or a bow to your finger? All right. I haven't, but I often make marks on my hand with just a Sharpie. Just a simple black mark. Doesn't even say anything, but it's a note. If I'm low on gas, I'll sometimes take, if I have a sweatshirt in my car, I'll tie it to the steering wheel. So the next time I get in the car, I have a memory aid. I need to get gas. We do these things constantly, but we may not think of them as notes. Where do they come from? The need to track. Finally, what do our notes say about us? And for here, I want to get a little bit deeper into culture and meaning. Notes have a literal message, right? So your note might say, 6 dozen eggs, 1 gallon of milk, whole, 45 bananas. That's the literal message. But our notes are also saying something about us. There's a meta message that's happening with our notes. And for that, I want to reference media ecology, which is a subfield of a discipline that many people aren't familiar with, and that's okay. But it is originally what I wanted to attend grad school for. And there's not many programs in media ecology, so I had to find an alternative path. But media ecology is this idea that every time a new technology, medium, or device works our way into our lives, it starts to change and influence how we think of the world, how we perceive time, how we perceive space, and how we perceive ourselves, and all those relationships. the three godfathers of media ecology. You got Marshall McLuhan, Canadian philosopher, well known for his statement of the medium is the message. Neil Postman, one of my dear favorites, a cultural critic who wrote extensively about society and technology, and specifically about education and the impact on education. He termed the coin media ecology, started a media ecology program at NYU. And then you have Walter Ong, who of these three gentlemen up here was the most traditional academic scholar of the three and did extensive work on the difference between what he called an oral culture and a literate culture. And in an oral culture, Ong identified the following traits: that an oral culture is unifying, it's concrete, it's communal, public, it encourages dialogue, but it's also restrictive because it's in the here and now, and we're not worrying about writing or the future or the past. It's the current present moment that's happening. That's the dominant worldview that he identifies for the traits of an oral culture, as opposed to a literate culture, which is the opposite, right? Which can be more isolating. We're starting to bury our heads into books. More abstract. We've got words and language to express ideas that aren't right in front of us. Focuses more on the individual rather than the communal. More on the private than the public. Encourages monologue, and specifically that inner monologue that's happening within inside your head. And when you're taking notes and making your grocery list for 45 bananas and 6 dozen eggs, you're having a conversation with yourself rather than with your community. But it's also expansionist, right? It changes the way, once we start writing things and noting them down, how we think of space, how we think of time. So let's take some of those ideas and apply them to some common note-taking systems and see if we can notice any application here. We have listing or outlining, right? So visually we can see this is a very top-down approach, right? It's got a very staggered hierarchy that's occurring here. Compare that to charting, another note-taking system where you have boxes, right? Really good for comparing and contrasting ideas and seeing relationships among things. You have mapping, very free form, no restrictions, anything goes in mapping. So we can see that even amongst these common note-taking systems, in the traditional sense of what we consider notes, there's a difference of how the information is being presented, right? When I was working on the notes for this talk that I'm doing today, I was using a combination of all three of these, because if I did just the traditional outline and list, I might be missing out on some of the more free-form things. Where does the skull fit in? The skull comes from mapping, obviously, treasures. So again, my point here is that how we're taking notes might influence what we're taking notes about and what we're noticing. How we take notes can influence what we note. So today we explored 3 questions. What are notes? How did they come about? And what do they say about us? My hope is that through this talk, you'll rethink, reconsider, and reassess what notes are to you, how you use them, and what they might mean to you. Going back to Socrates and Jay-Z, guys who never took notes in our traditional sense, though both were existing and at their prime in literate cultures of writing eras. Maybe, possibly, part of their brilliance, part of their greatness in their respective crafts is because they weren't limited in terms of their view through writing. I'll leave that for you to ponder. Thank you.